Michael had owned his modest suburban home for nearly 15 years. The above-ground pool in the backyard, installed by the previous owners, had been a source of both joy and frustration over the years. His children had grown up splashing in it during hot summers, but now that they were in college, the pool sat mostly unused. After 3 consecutive years of increasing maintenance costs and a significant leak that proved impossible to locate, Michael made the difficult decision to remove the pool entirely. The final straw came on a particularly warm April afternoon as Michael stood beside the pool, staring at the water level that had mysteriously dropped 3 inches overnight despite his best efforts to patch every conceivable crack. His neighbor Tom wandered over, beer in hand, and leaned against the fence. "Fighting a losing battle there, Mike?" Tom asked, taking a sip from his bottle. Michael sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "You have no idea. I've spent more on chemicals and repairs in the last 2 years than we did on our family vacation to Yellowstone. Kids don't use it much anymore anyway, right? Melissa mentioned your daughter's studying abroad this semester. Emma's in Barcelona until August, and Jason's got that internship in Chicago. They're not exactly rushing home to swim laps," Michael replied with a wistful smile. "Seems silly to keep pouring money into something that's become more of a headache than a joy." That evening, as Michael sat at his kitchen table surrounded by pool maintenance receipts, he calculated he'd spent over $3,200 in the past year alone. His wife Sarah placed a cup of coffee next to the scattered papers and peered over his shoulder. "That's a semester's worth of textbooks," she remarked quietly. Michael nodded, pushing the receipts away. "I think it's time, honey. The pool's had a good run, but maybe we should consider removing it and creating that garden patio you've always wanted." Sarah squeezed his shoulder. "You sure? I know how much you love teaching the kids to swim in that pool." "Those memories aren't going anywhere," Michael said, patting her hand. "But our bank account might if we keep this up." Over the next 2 weeks, Michael threw himself into research. He read online reviews of local contractors, joined homeowner forums to learn about the removal process, and visited the city office to understand permit requirements. He discovered the process would be more complex than he initially thought. Environmental considerations for draining the water, disposal of the materials, and backfilling the area all needed to be addressed properly. By late April, Michael had selected Riverside Contracting, a company with excellent reviews and fair pricing. He obtained all necessary permits from the city planning department and scheduled the removal for the first week of May, when the weather would be dry enough for the heavy equipment to access his backyard without damaging the lawn. The night before work was set to begin, Michael took one last swim in the pool. The water was cold, he hadn't bothered heating it this season. But there was something ceremonial about floating on his back, looking up at the stars one final time from this vantage point. Tomorrow would mark the end of an era for his family, but also the beginning of something new. He climbed out, dried off, and took a photo of the pool illuminated by the patio lights to send to his children. Unbeknownst to Michael, his neighbor Linda had been watching his backyard activities with increasing interest. From behind her pristine white plantation shutters, Linda Hargrove observed the contractors arriving at Michael's house with narrowed eyes and a cup of precisely steeped Earl Grey tea, never too dark, never too light. Linda had moved into the Maple Creek subdivision just 2 years ago following her divorce from a corporate attorney. She'd chosen the neighborhood for its property values and what the real estate agent had called its community charm. In Linda's mind, that charm required strict adherence to her personal standards of suburban perfection. Within 3 months of her arrival, Linda had filed formal complaints against the Paddles for their excessively aromatic Indian cooking, the Richardsons for their son's basketball hoop, an eyesore visible from the street, and the elderly Mr. Fitzgerald for allowing his front garden to grow unruly and haphazard. She'd successfully petitioned the HOA to ban street parking overnight and had suggested implementing a neighborhood dress code for residents checking their mail. It's about standards. She frequently announced at homeowners meetings her blonde bob never moving thanks to a generous application of hairspray. Property values depend on appearances, and I won't apologize for maintaining excellence. Michael had managed to stay off Linda's radar until now. Their properties shared only a small boundary at the rear corner of their lots, and Michael's tall privacy fence limited her view of his backyard. Their interactions had been limited to terse nods when collecting mail or the occasional forced small talk at neighborhood gatherings. That's the trick with Linda, Tom had warned Michael at last year's 4th of July block party. Stay invisible. The moment she notices you, it's like being marked by a predator. The community had unofficially dubbed her Karen, though never to her face. The nickname had originated when she demanded to speak to the manager at the neighborhood pool after children were splashing excessively during designated swim hours. 10-year-old Katie Wilson had whispered classic Karen, just loudly enough for the adults to hear, and the name stuck. Linda's interest in Michael's pool had begun accidentally. While standing on a stepladder to inspect her gutters last autumn, she'd glimpsed over his fence and noticed the pool's blue surface. Since then, she'd mentioned the neighbor's lovely pool during conversations, despite never having received an invitation to use it. In her mind, the pool contributed to the neighborhood's resort-like ambience and, by extension, her property value. When she'd overheard Michael mentioning pool removal to Tom last week, Linda had immediately added it to her mental list of community threats to monitor. She'd even gone so far as to research local ordinances regarding residential pools, certain there must be some regulation protecting her interests. Now, watching the contractors unload equipment from their trucks, Linda set down her teacup with a decisive clink against its saucer. She smoothed her beige linen pants and adjusted her designer watch. This situation required immediate intervention before Michael ruined the delicate ecosystem of property values she worked so diligently to cultivate. "Not on my watch," she murmured, reaching for her phone to call Cynthia from the HOA board. "Not in my neighborhood." Saturday morning dawned with perfect early autumn weather, crisp enough to hint at the changing season, but warm enough that a final swim seemed like an ideal farewell to summer. Emily had arrived the previous evening, immediately inspecting her pool and arranging her collection of pool floats in preparation for their last aquatic hurrah. After the promised chocolate chip pancake breakfast, they changed into swimwear and headed out to the backyard. Emily immediately claimed her favorite unicorn float, while David began setting up the pool vacuum and organizing the draining equipment they would use later. "I can't believe summer's over already," Emily sighed, trailing her fingers through the water. "School's been back for like 3 weeks and it already feels like I've been doing algebra forever." David chuckled. "That's how time works when you're a teenager. School days last centuries, but summer vanishes in seconds." They had been enjoying their final swim for about an hour, music playing from the waterproof speaker Emily had received for her birthday, when David noticed movement at the fence. He was in the middle of demonstrating his impression of a not very graceful dolphin, which had Emily doubled over with laughter, when Karen Wilson's face appeared above the wooden slats. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying clearly over Emily's giggles. Something in her tone immediately set David on edge. It wasn't the neighborly greeting he was accustomed to from their limited interactions. David swam to the edge of the pool closest to the fence. "Morning, Karen," he offered with a polite nod, water dripping from his hair. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Karen didn't return the pleasantry. Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the equipment David had laid out on the patio. "What exactly are you doing with all that?" she asked, gesturing toward the drainage pump and storage containers. "Just getting ready to take down the pool for winter," David explained, pulling himself up to sit on the edge. "The manufacturer recommends complete dismantle in 4. "You're taking it down?" Karen interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "Today?" David nodded, slightly confused by her intense reaction. "Yes, it's the perfect weather window according to the forecast, and Emily's here to help, so—" "You can't do that," Karen stated flatly, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the top of the fence. "You absolutely cannot take that pool down today." Emily had stopped splashing and was watching the exchange with growing curiosity from her unicorn float. David felt a flicker of annoyance at Karen's presumptuous tone, but kept his voice even. "I'm afraid I don't understand. This is just routine maintenance, though. My children are having a pool party here next weekend." Karen cut in again, speaking with such conviction that for a moment David wondered if he'd somehow forgotten agreeing to such an arrangement. "I'd already sent out invitations to the entire class. 15 kids are coming, and I've ordered a custom cake with a swimming theme." David stared at her, momentarily speechless. He glanced at Emily, whose expression mirrored his own confusion, before turning back to Karen. "I'm sorry, but there must be some misunderstanding," he said carefully. "We never discussed your family using my pool, Karen. I never agreed to host a party for your kids." Karen's face flushed red. "But it's right there," she insisted, as if the pool's physical presence constituted an open invitation. "My kids have been looking forward to this all summer. Zachary's birthday is next weekend, and I promised him a pool party. You can't just take it away now." Emily had silently paddled closer, her eyes wide as she witnessed the bizarre exchange. David felt a protective instinct rise as he noticed his daughter's discomfort. "Karen," David said, trying to maintain his composure as he reached for a towel, "I understand birthday parties are important, but I never agreed to let you use my pool. This is private property, and frankly, I'm surprised you plan an event at someone else's home without asking first." Karen's expression hardened as her children appeared beside her at the fence, summoned by the rising voices. 6-year-old Lily stared wide-eyed at the pool while her older brothers, Zachary and Ethan, looked on with obvious disappointment. "Is that our party pool, Mom?" Lily asked innocently. "Yes, sweetie, it's supposed to be," Karen answered, loud enough to ensure David heard. She turned back to David, her voice taking on a practiced sweetness that did nothing to mask the steel underneath. "Look, we don't need to make this difficult. The kids have been watching Emily enjoy this pool all summer. They've developed an expectation of use, an expectation of. David trailed off, genuinely baffled by her choice of words. Karen, watching someone use their own property doesn't create rights to it. That's not how this works. Emily had quietly exited the pool and wrapped herself in a towel, moving to stand slightly behind her father. David felt a surge of protectiveness at her discomfort. I've already put down a non-refundable deposit with a party planner, Karen continued, ignoring David's point entirely. We've ordered custom invitations with a picture of your pool on them. You took pictures of my backyard? David asked, his confusion turning to concern. It's visible from my second-floor window, Karen dismissed with a wave of her hand. Besides, Zachary has been telling everyone at school about his amazing pool party. Do you really want to be responsible for crushing a 10-year-old's dreams? David felt the conversation spiraling into absurdity. I'm sorry about the confusion, but my pool is not a community resource. If you'd asked me before making plans, I could have told you that. Karen's pleasant facade crumbled. This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that ruins neighborhoods, she snapped. We've been nothing but friendly to you since we moved in, and this is how you repay our goodwill? By denying children a birthday celebration? Dad, Emily whispered, tugging gently at his arm. This is getting weird. David nodded slightly to acknowledge Emily's discomfort before addressing Karen again. I think this conversation is over. I'm sorry about any confusion, but I'm taking down my pool today as planned. You can't do that, Karen insisted, her voice rising. The HOA clearly states that any external modifications visible to neighbors require prior approval. Taking down the pool would constitute a modification to your property's appearance. David stared at her in disbelief. That's not at all what those regulations mean, and you know it. The HOA approved the pool installation last spring, and temporary summer fixtures like pools are specifically exempt from winter removal restrictions. Karen's face flushed darker. We'll see about that. I'm on the architectural review committee now, and I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing Monday morning. She pulled out her phone. I have Derek Spencer's number. He's the HOA president. I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about this situation. Feel free to call whoever you want, David replied, his patience wearing thin. But it doesn't change the fact that this is my property and my pool. Karen narrowed her eyes. You're making a serious mistake, David. In communities like this, neighbors need to support each other. You might find yourself needing favors someday, and memories are long around here. With that thinly veiled threat, she ushered her disappointed children away from the fence, but not before Zachary shot David a resentful glare. As they disappeared into their house, Emily let out a long breath. Dad, what just happened? David shook his head, equally stunned by the exchange. I'm not entirely sure, honey, but I think we should finish up here quickly. For the confrontation, David and Emily had worked diligently through the afternoon, draining the pool and beginning the careful disassembly process. They ordered pizza for dinner and watched a movie, trying to salvage what remained of their weekend. Emily had seemed distracted, checking the windows periodically as if expecting to see Karen's face peering in at them. Don't worry about it, sweetie, David had assured her before bed. It was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. They'll blow over. Sunday morning dawned gray and misty. David had risen early, making coffee and checking his email while waiting for Emily to wake up. The house was peaceful, and he'd almost convinced himself that yesterday's confrontation had been exaggerated in his mind until a movement in the backyard caught his attention. David blinked, not trusting his eyes. Through the kitchen window, he could clearly see Karen and her husband Greg in his backyard. Greg looked uncomfortable, constantly glancing over his shoulder while holding one end of a garden hose that snaked over the fence from their property. Karen was directing him with emphatic gestures toward the partially dismantled pool, where the liner lay folded and the frame was half disassembled. What the hell? David muttered, rushing to the back door and throwing it open. What do you think you're doing? He called out, stepping onto his deck. Karen whirled around, but rather than looking guilty at being caught trespassing, she appeared indignant. Fixing your mess, she replied, hands on her hips. The party is Saturday, and we need time for the water to warm up. Greg at least had the decency to look ashamed, avoiding eye contact with David. The hose in his hands was already releasing water onto David's lawn. You're trespassing on private property, David stated firmly, struggling to keep his voice level. Turn off that water and get off my land immediately. This isn't just about you, David, Karen shot back, taking a step toward him. This is about community, about children. Your selfishness is ruining my son's birthday and destroying our standing in the neighborhood. David noticed movement behind him and realized Emily and Appear, still in her pajamas, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Emily, go inside and call, he began, but Karen cut him off. We've been nothing but patient with you, she continued, her voice rising. All those summer nights with your music playing too loud, the way you never trimmed the oak branches that hang over our yard, the time your sprinklers ran all night and flooded our garden. We've been good neighbors despite all that. David was momentarily speechless. None of those complaints had ever been mentioned to him before. "Dad," Emily's voice quavered from the doorway. "Should I call someone?" Karen's head snapped toward Emily. "You stay out of this. This is between the adults." "Don't speak to my daughter that way," David warned, his patience evaporating. "Both of you, off my property. Now, or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Karen challenged, pulling out her own phone. "I'm calling them myself. They should know about how you're threatening us and destroying community property." "Community prop? This is my pool," David exclaimed. "It's a neighborhood asset now," Karen insisted, already dialing. "You can't just take it away because you're feeling spiteful." Before David could respond, Karen had connected with 911. "Yes, emergency," she said into the phone, her voice suddenly trembling and frightened. A complete transformation from her confrontational tone seconds earlier. "We have a situation at 742 Oak Lane. My neighbor is threatening my family and destroying property that children use. We don't feel safe. Please hurry." David stood dumbfounded at the blatant misrepresentation. Behind him, he heard a small electronic beep and turned to see Emily, her hands shaking slightly, holding up her phone. "I'm recording all of this, Dad," she whispered. She's lying. 10 tense minutes passed with Karen and Greg remaining defiantly in David's yard. David had ushered Emily back inside, instructing her to continue recording through the window, but stay safely indoors. Karen had attempted to restart the refilling process twice, despite David's explicit demands to stop. When the police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, David felt both relief and apprehension. Two officers emerged, a taller, older man with graying hair at his temples and a younger woman with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Their name tags identified them as Officer Reynolds and Officer Maldonado. Karen immediately rushed toward them, tears suddenly streaming down her face. David marveled at the instantaneous transformation. "Thank goodness you're here," Karen cried, her voice hitching dramatically. "He's been threatening us, officers, all because we were trying to save the neighborhood pool that all the children use." Officer Reynolds maintained a neutral expression. "Ma'am, please calm down. We need to understand the situation." He looked between the three adults and the partially dismantled pool. "Who owns this property?" "I do," David stated clearly. "This is my house, my yard, and my pool. These individuals," he gestured to Karen and Greg, "entered my property without permission and attempted to refill my pool after I specifically began taking it down for winter storage." "It's not that simple," Karen interjected before the officers could respond. "This pool has been a community fixture all summer. We've had an understanding." "There was never any understanding," David countered firmly. "They've never once used this pool with my permission." Officer Maldonado held up a hand. "One at a time, please. Sir, do you have proof of ownership?" David nodded. "I can show you my deed and property survey. The property line is clearly marked by that fence, which they climbed over to enter my yard." "He's being deliberately difficult," Karen insisted. "My son's birthday party is this weekend. 15 children are expecting a pool party. The invitations are already sent out with pictures of this pool. He's trying to ruin a child's special day out of spite." Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, did you have explicit permission to use this pool for a party?" "We've been neighbors for 2 years," Karen replied, dodging the question. "The pool has always been here in the summer. The children have always been able to see it. There's an implied access." "That's not how property law works," Officer Maldonado cut in, her tone professional but firm. "Did you have verbal or written permission from the homeowner to use this pool?" Greg, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Karen, maybe we should just—" "Don't you dare back down now, Greg," Karen hissed at her husband before turning back to the officers. "This isn't just about legal technicalities. This is about community values and being a good neighbor." "Dad," Emily's voice came from the doorway. She had stepped outside, still holding her phone. "I have the recording from yesterday, too, when she first came over and demanded we keep the pool up. And I got everything from this morning." Officer Reynolds looked at Emily. "You got video of the interactions?" Emily nodded, approaching cautiously and offering her phone. "She never asked permission to use our pool. Ever. And